Coming on.
The battle for control of the House this November very well could come down to the state of Florida. According to CBS News' latest House estimate, Democrats are in position to win a 17-seat majority if the election were held today. That's outside of, but still near, the margin of error of 14 seats. Because of that, control of the House could come down to just a few races. CBS News has identified at least 4 races where Democrats have a chance to flip seats. 2 of those races, Florida's 26th and 27th districts, are here in South Florida. The 27th district, where we are right now, is considered the most likely in the state for Democrats to flip. Earlier, our CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns spoke to both the candidates running for this seat, which is being left open by retiring Republican Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. The Republican nominee for the seat is former Telemundo news anchor and first-time candidate Maria Elvira Salazar. She's running against former University of Miami President and Secretary of Health and Human Services under Bill Clinton, Donna Shalala. Caitlin asked Shalala about her views on impeachment should Democrats win back the House.
There has been talk among some Democrats in Washington about moving forward with articles of impeachment if Democrats are to take over the House. How do you feel about that? Would you support something like that?
Only if there is legal evidence. You don't impeach a president because you don't like his policies. You impeach a president when they commit high crimes and misdemeanors. There are a set of legal steps you have to take. So I believe it would be irresponsible to start talking about impeachment until the judiciary committees have laid out the case. So it's not the first thing on my agenda.
Are you hearing from voters about that? Or what are some of the issues that you're hearing from voters about? What are their top concerns?
Their top concerns are the affordability of health care and an assault weapons ban, protecting our children. Look, I was at a restaurant the other day and I met a family, and the little boy said, "You running for president?" And I said, "No, I'm running for Congress." And I said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" He said he wanted to be a police officer. I said, "That's terrific." I said, "Why do you want to be a police officer?" He said, "To protect the kids in my school." Wow.
Have you seen the politics of gun control change over the past year?
I think I've seen the politics of gun control get slightly more bipartisan. Okay. When I was in the Clinton administration, we negotiated an assault weapons ban for 10 years. So I've actually been in the middle of those bipartisan negotiations. We need to do it again. We have to do it again. We have to do it again for that little boy. No child should go to school and fear that they won't come home in this country. That's our responsibility. This election is about them, not about us. It's about them.
And here with me now is CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. She's here with Florida political analyst Dr. Susan McManus and CBS News political contributor and Republican strategist Leslie Sanchez. Right, a lot of territory to cover here. First to you, Susan. This is a district that went for Hillary Clinton in 2016 by 20 points, which is why many believe that Shalala, given her long history, of course, with the Clintons as HHS secretary and president of the Clinton Foundation, that she would have the advantage here. Do you believe that to be the case?
I don't see that it's an advantage because there are some other disadvantages that are very important to note. One is being able to speak Spanish. A huge portion of this district is Spanish speaking. And it's also true, we know from studying Hispanics and voting and so forth, that often the party or the country of origin is more important than the political party. We've seen it in some voting up in the Orlando area, with Puerto Ricans voting for a Republican when they were registered Democrat because he was from Puerto Rico. So I think here that large Cuban contingency in that district has made Salazar very competitive. And Donna Shalala, while well known, is still tied to the Clinton administration. And I think that some of the younger people are really trying to move beyond that. I don't know that that was particularly an asset either.
So, Caitlin, after speaking to both candidates, what is your take on this race?
Well, it's such an interesting dynamic because Hillary Clinton won this district by double digits, and Democrats do well here on the national level. But at the congressional level, it's really going to be a test of whether the Republican candidate Salazar can separate herself from the national environment. I talked to her about Donald Trump. I talked to her about immigration, and she very much tried to separate herself from the national rhetoric that the Republican Party vis-a-vis Donald Trump is talking about. So we're going to get a test, really, of how local elections can still be in this highly polarized environment. And Shalala acknowledged that as well. She kind of acknowledged the Republican DNA in the district as it pertains to the congressional races, and also brought up the idea of trying to lean into kind of the more national themes and this reaction, this referendum that she believes voters want to put on Donald Trump versus the local politics, local issues, and just at the end of the day, people knowing who their candidate is.
Leslie, let me ask you, first of all, how important is it for Republicans to hold on to this particular seat? And also, give us some perspective here on the Hispanic population, because I think when a lot of people consider Miami, they think about the Cuban American, the Cuban population here, but it's much more diverse than that.
It's extremely diverse. In many ways, this is the gateway to Latin America. And what's fascinating, if you watch the local news here, it's not uncommon to have a story about Venezuela, whether it's in English or Spanish, because the community is so diversified and so Latin American focused. But this district, not only is it important to the president and the Republican Party, it's important because of the nuance. This is true bipartisanship in an area that is represented currently by Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who was the first Hispanic woman. She held that seat for 29 years. In many ways, she's the godmother to many of the state's current leadership. Marco Rubio was her intern, and Carlos Curbelo, who's in a competitive race, he also worked for her. And part of that is her retail politics. People understand she goes door to door. And in the Republican nominee, you definitely have a mirroring effect of trying to understand the local issues, a very nuanced state, and a state that will, a district that will split ticket. They will identify for the person before they do the party.
So another seat that Democrats are targeting heavily is Florida's 26th district. CBS News is rating it the closest congressional race in the state. Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo is running for his third term in Congress as a moderate Republican who can work across the aisle, now while still being critical of the president. Now, Caitlin, I know you talked to his opponent, Ecuadorian immigrant Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, about why she's running. Let's listen to some of that.
Look, I'm a Latina immigrant. I came here when I was 14 with my mother, with my sisters. This community has thousands and thousands of immigrants. We've all come here for the opportunities that this country has provided. Education has brought me to where I am today, and I have been working to better our community. We are not criminals. We are not people that are not contributing to the economy. What we need to do is protect our dreamers. We have thousands of dreamers. I have a very, very close friend, part of our family. He's a dreamer that hasn't been able to drive. When that permit expires, they can't go to school, they can't drive, they're living in fear. And so, as an immigrant, I can tell you that it's been very offensive, and I think it's offended many, many immigrants. But what people are concerned about right now is making sure that we can pass a Clean Dream Act and keep TPS recipients on that act, on that bill as well. We are seeing images of people that are living in desperation. The hateful rhetoric coming out of this administration is not helping at all. We need to find some common ground and really talk about immigration and have those conversations that are tough to have, but that we need to find real solutions.
So your opponent has been talking about bipartisanship. He's been talking about the ways in which he stands up to the president when he sees fit and agrees with him on some things. Immigration is another issue that he feels passionately about. What do you think, what is encouraging you to run this cycle if the congressman is, acting in a bipartisan way?
You know, we have a congressman that turned his back on this community time and time again when we needed him the most. There was an opportunity for him to sign on to a bipartisan bill that had already over 200 sponsors, both Democrats and Republicans. He failed to do that. It could have passed in the House and protected dreamers. He failed to pull through a bill that also had bipartisan support. He was calling for a discharge petition, but then he caved in to the most extreme Republicans in the party. He talks about being part of a climate caucus, but that doesn't introduce any sort of legislation that can take real action for climate change. And we don't trust him. That's what I hear. The reason why I decided to run is because he voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now, in my community, we have 100,000 families that get their health care through the ACA. And I can tell you, there were voters, there were constituents, there were friends of mine that called me to tell me that they had called Congressman Curbelo. They had met with him. They had begged him not to take that vote. And he went ahead and did that. That was the day that I knew I had to step in and run.
Caitlin, it sounds certainly like the political pressure is on for Carlos Curbelo. Has he done enough to distance himself from the president?
Well, what's different about this district compared to the one we were just talking about is that the Republican candidate is running again. The Republican incumbent, I should say, is running again. So he is trying to make sure that he carves out an identity in the district that's separate from the national environment. Again, trying to kind of localize this race. And he makes a point to say he stands up to the president when he agrees with him or disagrees with him and doesn't when he doesn't. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at the polling, he seems to be in a pretty good position right now. So it, again, will be a test of whether he can withstand this kind of national attention in a district like this. And you have the candidate that I interviewed, the Democrat, who has been encouraged by the environment to run. But you heard her say health care. Every candidate that I talked to today and voters that I was talking to yesterday when I was out following some groups canvassing brought up health care over and over and over again. And so it is a national issue, but especially an issue here that cuts across demographics, cuts across age, cuts across both of these really competitive districts.
Leslie, let me ask you, from your perspective as a Republican strategist, you heard the litany of attacks there against Congressman Curbelo. If you're a moderate Republican in the age of Trump, how do you respond to that?
Sure. I think in the case of Carlos Curbelo, those are really difficult attacks to stick, because he's somebody who's extremely well known for connecting in his local community. He followed in the footsteps of Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and I say that, you can't say that lightly. He really understands the diversity and the nuance within the district. And she started her conversation talking about dreamers and kind of the fairness of that. I don't think that you're going to find a Republican candidate who's going to say, especially in South Florida, that they're against that ideal, but they want the right approach. And I don't think he's going to say something like, I want to completely repeal, but it was repeal and replace, find a better way, include pre-existing conditions to serve an aging and an ethnically diverse low-income population. That's where Curbelo stands to have an advantage. And I do think the Trump wave that will happen with Republican voters should benefit him on election.
You had talked about going out with these canvassers, and I want to play a clip from that because this is fascinating. This was the canvassers with the Libre Initiative, which is a nonpartisan organization working to empower the Hispanic community. You went door to door with the group's Florida director to talk about issues important to Hispanics. Let's go ahead and listen to that.
They're thinking about healthcare, obviously. That's important for the community. Economy is always pop up in every election cycle, and it continues to be an important topic. Taxes is also an important topic. People are saying that they don't want to see taxes going up. Other people want to see a change in the healthcare system right now in the country, and obviously this is curious because people have the idea that Hispanics or Latinos, they only care about immigration, but actually it's in the bottom of the topics. It's important, it's a sensitive topic for the community, but that is not the most important topic for the community.
All right, so Caitlin, let me first ask you, what were your impressions of that? What were sort of the takeaways from your conversation, your time with the canvassers?
Well, this was an interesting group because it's a nonpartisan group, but conservatives, like the Americans for Prosperity, a conservative group, is working with them to make inroads in the Hispanic community among conservatives. And they're trying to, get people out to vote, talk about certain causes that they think that they can identify, whether it's the economy, on health care, on taxes, and family values as well. So we talked to a variety of different folks who were there, mostly only Spanish speaking. So we had the help of a translation there. And healthcare came up a lot. A lot of these voters were older voters, and they wanted to actually show up on election day. They wanted to kind of have that experience of going to the polls the way that they're used to on election day. So these are not people who are going to turn out in the early vote. But in talking to these folks and talking to the candidates, Democrats. You're seeing a generational divide, and everybody makes the point to say that this is not a monolithic voting group, that, you know, you have various members of this community who have very different backgrounds and experiences. When I was talking to Salazar, the Republican candidate in this district running against Shalala, she said a lot of people in the Hispanic community coming from Cuba or Venezuela often talk about the reaction, the negative reaction they have to communism or to socialism. So they're more drawn to the Republican side of things, where you have Shalala saying that younger Hispanic voters are more drawn to what the Democrats are talking about. So it's really important when we're talking about this group. Both sides are really working hard to turn them out in a midterm when enthusiasm isn't as typically as high as it is in a presidential.
Let's talk more about this generational issue. And Susan, I know you have a lot to say on this, but Leslie, let me start with you, because I think, again, when you think about Miami, a lot of folks think Cuban American population, always Republican. That's just how it is, and that's how it's been. But that's not what we're necessarily hearing.
Not at all. I mean, there's certainly not. You're not going to see Cuban sympathizers. I mean, we constantly hear from the candidates here that they're fighting for freedom. They are freedom fighters. You know, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen called herself the happy warrior. So anybody who follows in this footstep of South Florida politics understands the principle of fighting freedom and human rights. That's very true. But now you have a younger generation who's looking for what things Caitlin talked about: economic opportunity, economic prosperity, access to capital, opening small businesses. And particularly with Libre Institute, they understood in the rule of law that people were fleeing Latin America in legal ways. They wanted and supported rule of law, but they also wanted to be able to look in their bank account and the same amount of money is there in the morning that when they went to bed, because they had devaluation of the currency, things would disappear, the government would confiscate your items when they came from very harsh conditions in Latin America. So this is an open opportunity for Republicans.
So Susan, I apologize, we're getting the hard wrap here, but I really want to get your take on this generational question, because this is something that you point to as something that is really significant that people need to pay attention to.
Florida's no longer just an old folks home, as we used to be called. You have to come here, and this election is the election where we have finally seen the maturation of the millennials politically. The two youngest generations, the millennials and the Gen Zers, have only known two presidents, and their views of Washington are very negative, and they're registering as no party affiliation. But something else is really interesting. The younger generation is very racially and ethnically diverse. 50%, only 50% of the youngest generation is white, compared to 76% of our registered voters over 65. So the age and racial diversity and their ways of communicating with politicians, don't show them a TV ad. They're not going to watch it. You have to reach them in other ways, and candidates are really, really struggling to figure out how to reach this group. In my judgment, this election is either going to be, one candidate is going to be either made or lose because of the young vote. They're that powerful right now. Over half of our registered voters.
All right, and with that, I want to thank Caitlin Huey-Burns, Susan McManus, and Leslie Sanchez. Really appreciate the insights.